Hi, everyone. My name is Barbra Dillon. I am the editor-in-chief of Fanbase Press, an award-winning comic book publisher and geek culture community that celebrates fandoms and creates new ones. I'm honored to have a wonderfully talented group of panelists with me today for a 20th anniversary retrospective discussion on the film The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, as part of the WonderCon at Home virtual panel series. For those interested in more retrospective discussions like this one, be sure to tune in to Fanbase Press's flagship podcast, The Fanbase Weekly, on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, which provides both the latest in geek news and in-depth retrospectives like this one. But without further ado, let's meet our panelists. First, we have Justin Peniston, a Fanbase Press contributor, co-creator of the hard-boiled fantasy comic Hunter Black, and a writer who has worked on such projects as Mega Man Fully Charged, Ben 10, and the upcoming Sonic Prime. Hello, Justin.
Hello, Barbara. Hello, everyone.
Good to have you here. In addition, we have Phillip Kennedy Johnson, a comic book writer with credits including House of L, Superman Worlds of War, The Last God, Warlords of Appalachia, Last Sons of America, and Marvel's Alien. Phillip, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you.
Good to see you. We also have Claire Thorne, who is a co-host of the Fanbase Weekly podcast, as well as the founder of Unexpected Hobby and the creator of the award-winning crafting book, A Geek's Guide to Cross-Stitch, Journeys in Space. Hello, Claire.
Hello, everyone.
And last but certainly not least, we have Drew Siragusa, who is a Fanbase Press senior contributor and co-host of the Fanbase Weekly podcast. Hello, Drew.
Hello.
Excellent. Well, we're going to dive in, but before we do, of course, we want to offer a huge spoiler warning. Of course, we will be doing a deep dive into the plotting, the themes, the structure of The Lord of the Rings. So if in the past 20 years you have not yet seen The Fellowship of the Ring, you may want to check it out before diving into this conversation. But for those who may be uninitiated, set in the fictional world of Middle-earth, The Lord of the Rings is a film series of 3 epic fantasy adventure films directed by Peter Jackson and based on the novel written by J.R.R. Tolkien. The first of the films, The Fellowship of the Ring, follows the hobbit Frodo Baggins as he and the Fellowship embark on a quest to destroy the One Ring and to ensure the destruction of its maker, the Dark Lord Sauron. So for each of you, looking back at The Fellowship of the Ring 20 years after its release, what was your experience in revisiting the film versus your initial viewing? Justin, we're going to start with you.
So I was quite a fan of the books growing up. I have a vivid memory one night of having the chicken pox and being unable to sleep due to the itching and reading the entirety of The Fellowship of the Ring and half of the Two Towers in one night. I love these books. I'm a hardcore D&D guy. So, you know, and D&D is rooted in Tolkien. I write a fantasy webcomic that is rooted, you know, in many ways in the tropes of fantasy that Tolkien either created or popularized. I went into this movie with low expectations. I had a low bar, you know, because I knew I was such a fan and I didn't want to be disappointed. Although I remember seeing even the trailer and being super excited. I mean, just because it felt, even the trailer, seeing, you know, the Fellowship cross over the mountain, it felt the way it was supposed to feel to me. This film, which of the 3 is probably the most divergent from its book, still exceeded my wildest expectations. While it does diverge, it only diverges in necessary ways. And it's a real treat. It's so good that I have a hard time reading the books now, because when I want to experience the story, it just makes sense to go back to the movie.
Fair enough. Phillip, what about you?
And when this first came out, I watched it an unthinkable number of times in the theater live, just like over and over. Because I mean, I've been waiting for that for so long. I mean, I loved the animated films just because it's what there was. And I still completely unironically love the Hobbit, the animated Hobbit that they did. But the Lord of the Rings movies that they made after that were, you know, that's what there was, and I loved them because that's what there was. But when I found out about this new movie coming out, the excitement I felt for that was just unbelievable. And when I saw it, it was so perfect. mean, Justin's right, it diverges, but mostly in the things that it leaves out, right? Like it's, I miss the Tom Bombadil stuff, and I miss the stuff with the Barrow, and there are things in it that I still wanted to see in it, but it's still, long. It's still plenty long, and it had everything that it really needed to carry the story forward. And I just could not be happier with how it was. I think it turned out, it's a total masterpiece. I think it's Peter Jackson's best film. I felt that the other ones actually diverge from the books more as far as tone. Like it feels less like Tolkien the further in they get. And that's why for me, the first one is just this unimpeachable masterpiece that I don't have any problem with it at all. If you were to put a gun to my head and ask me to complain, I don't know what I would say, honestly. I mean, when I was writing The Last God, my epic horror fantasy series at DC, Black Label, it was the Tolkien stuff. Tolkien was not my first experience with high fantasy literature, but it was kind of this top shelf thing that I eventually found. I was reading stuff like Dragonlance and the Shannara books and things that were great. But then when I discovered Tolkien, I was like, I don't know why I never read these. And I read them, and I was just, from that point on, it just became such an intrinsic part of who I was. The big risk of doing the epic fantasy book was that I would unintentionally be ripping off Tolkien the entire time because it was just so close to my heart. Yeah, I could go on. I'm gonna bring this to a close because I could just go on and on about how much I love it and how perfect I think that first movie is.
Not to worry, Philip. That's why we have all of you here on this panel. You are huge Tolkien fans and huge Lord of the Rings fans. So we're super happy to have you here. And we will definitely be doing a deeper dive into where the film diverges from the book. So we'll be doing that as well in just a moment. But Claire, let's go to you.
It's a similar story. I started reading Tolkien in junior high, elementary school. I remember viscerally discovering The Hobbit and reading The Hobbit, and it was my first, and it's probably been my longest lasting introduction to fantasy. I'm more of a science fiction fan. So my love of fantasy kind of begins and ends with Tolkien in a lot of ways. The Lord of the Rings, my anticipation of the movies coming out, you can talk to my husband and various other family members who I tormented for months with just my complete inability to talk about anything other than these movies that were being done, and how impossible I thought the task was, yet I was so excited for what the result might be. And like Justin said, the initial images that we were being treated to started to give you this hope of like, oh, I feel like they're understanding who these characters are and what this world should look like. And just that tidbit of it was just enough to, I was insufferable for months. And I've never been that way about anything since, really. It's been, watching these movies has been just such a constant part of my life, as is, going back and rereading and doing everything else. It's just really hard to separate my experience with this story from everything that I do. It's the first foundational thing that colors my theory of criticism about everything, about superheroes, about science fiction, about just name something that I love. What I learned from reading Tolkien is it affects all of those things. So I will stop right there as well, just for that moment.
And Drew, of course, we'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
For me, my fantasy journey began with The Hobbit. A friend of the family let us borrow his beautifully illustrated, this big hardcover version of The Hobbit, and my dad and I started reading it together when I was 8, and then then I saw the movie, like the cartoon, and then then as I got a little older, people were like, "There's more," and I was like, "Wait, what?" And so I got to read Lord of the Rings, and like everyone else, I was like cautiously optimistic when I found out they were making it a movie, because I was like, "There's no way they can do it," but I want them to. And you saw the trailers, and I was filled with awe seeing it, both originally and then now on the other side 20 years later. I was filled with a much different awe looking back and going, like when it first came out, I was like, I can't believe this exists now. But now it's I can't believe how much wouldn't exist without this. When watching this just the other day, I just was like, Infinity War and Endgame would not be the movies they are without the big battle scenes we had in Lord of the Rings, and what that laid the groundwork for filmmaking, the future of filmmaking that we are now living in.
That's a great point, Drew. Well, while our conversation for this panel today will be predominantly about the film, we would be remiss if we didn't, of course, touch upon the source material. So I'm going to venture a guess that everyone on this panel is a fan of the books, as you said that you were. But with that in mind, what were your thoughts on either the faithfulness or the overall execution of Peter Jackson's adaptation? And additionally, were there any creative liberties that you felt worked to the film's advantage or to its disadvantage? And Drew, we'll start with you this time.
The biggest advantage, and I'm going to go with Return the King here just for biggest advantage, because it's kind of one movie, the whole thing. I just think intercutting the stories instead of having half of the movie be one story and then half of the movie being another story was the best change they made to these movies, because otherwise we would just kind of been like, what's going over here that we haven't seen for 3 hours? I think in general, like was mentioned earlier, most of the changes were trimming things, and I don't necessarily think they were automatically better than the books, but overall the decisions were the right decisions to condense and adapt the material. I like Tom Bombadil too, but he doesn't need to be there. Like, he can be cut, and there's no obvious void that is needed to fill in there. So I think overall they made all the right decisions and changes.
Fair enough. Philip, what about you?
I think so too. I think they did a masterful job. The changes that they made, agreed. That the stuff with the Barrows and Tom Bombadil are not really, they don't really drive the story forward. Like, if there was stuff to cut, I mean, they all turned out so long and thorough. To make it longer for things like those, just to add in adventures, like for texture, almost like it would have been a disservice to the films. And things like beefing up Arwen's role in it was very important. I mean, like the Aragorn Arwen subplot was obviously very important, and it's cool we got to see that play out. That wouldn't have happened if we had not, put her into the river, things like that. I really think it's a masterpiece, and I can't fault them for any of the changes that they made from the original source material.
Excellent. And Justin, what about you?
I am muted. Okay. I, like everyone else, I like Tom Bombadil. I like the Old Forest and the Barrow Wights. I don't especially love Glorfindel, who's the character that Arwen replaces in much of her action. So I thought that was an excellent choice. But a lot of those things sort of skew towards the Beowulf / the Odyssey / epic poetry feel that the novels have, and I think that's an intentional choice. I mean, that's where, big fantasy stories get their roots from those epic poems. And that is, and Tolkien, if nothing else, was, digging deep into literature and language. But these films are not epic poems. These films are a quest. They're a big story. So a lot of those, I don't want to say superfluous because they're wonderful, but a lot of those elements that don't pertain specifically to Frodo and the Ring and the return / rise of Aragorn, they didn't really have a place in a film series that's already, coming close to, 9-10 hours. So it's hard, especially because when these films stayed true to the books, they stayed really true to the books. I mean, how many filmmakers can you think of that would be so slavish in actually translating and using the languages that Tolkien created? Or really, sort of making the actors wrap their tongues around rolling their R's and, you know, pronouncing things just so. I think that Peter Jackson wasn't remaking the books. He was making a series of movies. And he made the choices that best suited that medium. And I think, you know, it plays out because I think these movies are tremendously faithful to the books in many, many, many ways.
Claire, as someone who, as I know personally, watches these films annually with the Silmarillion alongside her,
yes.
to be able to enjoy all of that superfluous material. What are your thoughts? Do you feel like you were missing these items, or do you feel happy in knowing that you still have the books to look back to?
It's everything that Jackson did is just so nicely woven into. He's taken from the books and made really bold choices about how to change things, because, you know, when we're talking about bringing Arwen into the story, I love that because it's a female character that gets to be added into the story. It helps give weight to Aragorn's motivations that is otherwise kind of stripped away. There's, you know, the idea of him having a personal relationship that is as important to him as his destiny that's important to me. And that's a bold choice because Arwen is also not in the book of Lord of the Rings. She's in the appendices. So he's taking story from places, you know, in things that Tolkien wrote that I am very much in love with, and using them in making this story work on screen in a way that just, I can't really find a lot of fault with it. And yeah, I still watch the movies because they work so well with the text, Tolkien's text. I'm able to sit there with the book open on my lap, and we're watching a scene, you know, whatever scene in the movie, and I'm going to the text in the book and I'm reading it again. And then I flip to the appendices so that I can remind myself what happens to all of these characters after the story is over. And I'm not a big Silmarillion reader. Like, I've never read it cover to cover, but I've dipped in and out, and I use it as a source, a reference source of just giving me more story, because that's always my reaction. And I think that's what ultimately tells me that Peter Jackson did a good job with the text and in adapting it, is that I am never, after how many hundreds of times have I watched these movies, I am never not motivated and eager to go back and read and find some new detail that connects to the movies from whatever part of the text I can get my hands on. I'm always doing that. And there's always something more to do. So yeah, somehow, I don't know how he did it. And Fran Walsh and Philippa, I can never remember Philippa's last name, which is horrible. So sorry.
Is it Boyens?
Boyens, yes, I think all of the writers who worked on, you know, constantly worked on that adaptation through the entire filming of these three movies. Good Lord, more Oscars. I mean, just if we could just give them more stuff now, I would do it every single time I watch it. So.
From all of your mouths, and of course from the critical response and from mass audiences all over the world, these films are regarded as some of the greatest and most influential films to date. And Tolkien is certainly a huge fan of the source material, but it really took almost over 60 years for this to become a fully produced live action film. In your opinion, do you feel that the story found such great success because Jackson was such a huge fan and had such a fondness for Tolkien's work? Or, you know, what do you feel was the barrier to seeing this fully realized? Claire, why don't we start with you this time?
I think that it comes down to the fact that Peter Jackson was willing to fight to have the production of this movie be not just, you know, where they decided to allow him to do one movie. We'll let you do one and we'll see how it goes, and then maybe we can do a sequel. The fact that they were able to come together with a production team that agreed to take the risk to let 3 movies of this scope be done all at once was the only way this story could have been done on screen this way as movies. It's still mind-boggling to me that all of those pieces came together, and that it didn't fall apart at some point. I mean, that happened so much, and I remember being so terrified that, you know, something would go wrong that whole process. But it's Peter Jackson, and it's a lot of, when you watch the additional material, the behind the scenes, the making of, you know, and you hear all of the different people talk about the scope of the project that they agreed to work on. It's the fact that all of those people came together and did that, from the very top of the production team all the way down. It's this rare and unique moment in cinema history that I don't know that we'll ever really have duplicated again.
And Phillip, as a creator who has both created vast worlds like this with amazingly vast characters, and also come into existing worlds and properties, what is your experience with this? And do you feel like you completely understand why it took so long for this to be fully realized?
Without his vision of what this was going to be, when I say he, I mean, I'm collectively talking about Peter Jackson and Fran and Philippa. When they really wanted to, they had this vision of what they wanted to do. But then if you actually look into the process of what it took to get this thing made and all the missteps that almost happened, and how this could have been a tragedy. Like, this could have been, if they hadn't stuck this landing on this first movie, we wouldn't have a real Lord of the Rings film or show for generations. You know, like, this would have been this huge thing. And it was almost that. I mean, God, thank God for these people. When you apparently, okay, so Jackson had made these odd little movies before that, I think in New Zealand, and then had been discovered by Hollywood, like, hey, this guy's doing good stuff, we should bring him into the fold. And he was kind of under the thumb of Harvey Weinstein, I guess, for a while. And it was going to get made, Weinstein was going to let him do his Lord of the Rings, his cute little Lord of the Rings thing, as a way to get him on board to do other things. But he didn't really believe in it, like Weinstein didn't. He was like, well, we'll cap you at 75 million total for both movies. And let's do 2 Lord of the Rings movies. We'll get you out of your system, then we'll get you on the contract to do these other things that we actually want done, like King Kong and whatever else. And only because Jackson and crew believed in it so much, and was willing to actually kind of screw over Weinstein to get this thing made the way it was supposed to get made, did this happen. And even that, I mean, even when things run smoothly, getting a movie made is like winning the lottery, even after it gets optioned. Like, there's so many things that can go wrong at every step. So, I mean, the fact that it got made, not only got made, but got made with people who really, truly love it and were willing to potentially screw over their own careers, and super powerful people to do it, is the only way that we have this crazy Triple Crown winner movie, where it really is a miracle that it turned out as good as it did. Yeah, without Jackson, Fran, and Philippa's vision in this movie, there's no way it would have turned out like this, where they managed to gather all these people who just believe in it. So, like, the original concept artists and actors and people who just love it as much as he did. It was just this once in a lifetime thing.
Justin, what about you?
You know, first of all, I think that genre fiction was ghettoized in Hollywood for so long. I mean, sci-fi, I mean, they called them B movies, you know. I mean, that was their way of saying this is not something you take seriously, and certainly not something you invest a lot of time and money into. It wasn't until Star Wars, really, that the idea of fantasy on screen was considered really viable. I mean, there was a sword and sandals drama based on, you know, historical figures or classical myth, but none of that stuff was. It was always expensive and too hit or miss to rely on, you know. And adapting big novels like that, I mean, David Lynch's Dune was a massive failure, you know, whether you like it or not. The movie did not do well and was not critically well received. So there was, you know, Hollywood looked down its nose at genre, you know, by and large. I mean, it's still a tough thing for a genre film to do really well come award season, you know, these films being the notable exception. And then you couple that with the fact that it's such an ambitious project to do this trilogy. You know, and there, you know, as I recall, Peter Jackson was prepared to make it 2 films, and that's what he's gearing himself up for. And in his, you know, machinations and, you know, negotiations, was offered a 3rd film. He was like, yes, I'll do it. Yes. You know, which of my children do you want? You know, and, you know, I think it's kind of like Phillip said, you know, it really was, you know, a comedy of errors that came out to be a Shakespearean masterpiece, you know.
And Drew, what about you?
Yeah, I agree. I definitely think that this was the perfect storm of everything hitting right. Like, obviously, this creative team wasn't the first ones to be passionate about trying to make this, but they were the ones that had the know-how, and then also technology had caught up. Like, had you had the same crew making it 20 years earlier, it wouldn't have the scope that they had. It would feel much smaller and claustrophobic, and it wouldn't have that Tolkien-esque, this is a gigantic world. And then just even lining up with the cast, like, I no longer could imagine anyone else playing those roles. Like, had this been at a different time, the movie would have had a different feel with a different Frodo or a different Gandalf. That just everything clicked right at the right time. And even just to have Christopher Lee, who was friends with Tolkien, to be like, well, actually, this is how he would have done it this way on set, to have that, you know, clout, to be like, have someone who knew him and was able to enhance this. It just, everything clicked at all the right times for this.
The idea, and just to footnote what Drew was just saying, the idea of technology being where it was at exactly that moment. I think even if you'd done this movie 5 years earlier, it would have been a wildly different movie. They went into production on this just at the right time, where they were able to do what they did with Gollum. If it had been anything less than what they achieved with that character and Andy Serkis's work on really creating the technology to do that kind of character creation, it would have just collapsed in the middle.
You're here.
But
I mean, in that regard, they were super ahead of their time. I mean, Hollywood still struggles to do vibrant motion capture characters or digitally created characters. I mean, Gollum, if someone were to say to me that Gollum is the best digital character ever done on screen, I couldn't argue with that, you know? And this movie's 20 years old, you know?
Well, Drew, you brought up a great point, and that is the cast. I'd love to take a moment to speak about the cast, and it is truly star-studded. We've got Elijah Wood, Ian McKellen, Liv Tyler, Viggo Mortensen, Sean Astin, Kate Blanchett, John Rhys Davies, Christopher Lee, Hugo Weaving, Andy Serkis, Sean Bean. I mean, I could keep going and going and going and going. It's incredible. But for each of you, what were your impressions overall of the whole ensemble? And were there any standout performances for you? Justin, we'll start with you this time.
This movie, okay. So when I heard about the casting initially, I was super excited because Aragorn is arguably he's probably one of my 3 favorite characters in all of literature. And I really liked Viggo Mortensen already. You know, I had seen him in small roles, but he was always great. He plays Lucifer in The Prophecy, the Christopher Walken movie, and he is chilling and wonderful. And, you know, so, and plus I liked that they didn't go for a young, classically handsome guy. They went with someone who looked a little weathered, who looked like he'd been ranging the Western continent for however long, you know, and that meant a lot to me. Ian McKellen, though, is the beating heart of these movies, in my opinion. You know, if you had asked me beforehand to choose between Sean Connery, who they tried to get, and who, if he had accepted the role, would have made more money off of that role than any actor's ever made off of any role. if you had asked me then, to choose between Sean Connery and Ian McKellen, I would have chosen Sean Connery, every single time, because I didn't really know Ian McKellen that well, but Ian McKellen, his work is almost without flaw, especially just in terms of capturing the distinctions between Gandalf the Grey and Gandalf the White, which is something I love. I'm a Raiders of the Lost Ark fan. I love John Rhys Davies, and without these movies, we wouldn't even know who Andy Serkis was. We wouldn't know who Orlando Bloom is. I mean, these were star-creating roles for them. The casting was impeccable. There is not a single character that I feel is miscast or isn't as good as it can be. And even the smaller roles, Miranda Otto, I mean, I know she's not in this movie, but Miranda Otto as Éowyn is just breathtaking with her performance. It's the casting is wonderful across the board.
Drew, what about you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is one of those that, like, you have in your head who these characters are when you read them, and those no longer exist. It's these actors and actresses. Like that when when I read this, it's not my interpretation of Aragorn. It's it's them. It is not. I don't know. They are so iconic now in these roles and so perfect that like I was saying, like any other cast in this movie would have a drastically different feel. Like it is very personally these actors and also personally the characters. Just perfect.
Philip, what about you? What are your thoughts on the cast?
Everybody's perfect. There are people that I could see as other people potentially, but it's hard to imagine it because like everyone said, everyone's cast so well. You could have put Sean Connery in that lead role. It's so hard to imagine it now though. Like Ian McKellen just nails it. I honestly, deep down, knowing what a devotee Christopher Lee was to Tolkien, part of me really wonders what it would have been like with him as Gandalf. He's so well cast as Saruman though. I mean, he's perfect for that role. He is the iconic, movie villain kind of. So he's perfect. But just because I know what a personal fan he was of Tolkien himself, I would have loved to have seen him as Gandalf just to see, And Andy Serkis might have the best performance of anyone in that film. He's incredible. Well, not that film, but the films. He's just such a powerhouse in the trilogy, and later in The Hobbit. But my heart belongs to, as far as Gollum, man, the animated Hobbit is so damn creepy. The Brother Theodore performance in the Hobbit cartoon is just off the chart creepy. I love it. I love that performance. Even he's such an odd duck as an actor anyway. He's like this crazy, he had this crazy stand-up monologue thing that he would do. He's just such a, oh God, he's perfect. So yeah, as amazing as Andy Serkis was as Gollum, he's overshadowed a bit to me by Brother Theodore, but that's nobody's fault. Yeah, Gandalf's perfect. God, who else? Those are the ones that stand out to me, I guess, the most. But every single person is so expertly cast.
And Claire, what about you? What are your thoughts on the cast?
Oh, it's really interesting hearing everybody else talk about what they thought about the casting at the time that it happened. To be honest, I think the actor I knew the most, who was the biggest name to me at the time that the Fellowship of the Ring came out, was probably Cate Blanchett. And it signaled to me, that's one of the things I'm sure that signaled to me, oh, yeah, that's right. She is Galadriel. There is no other Galadriel. This makes sense. And I am overwhelmingly fond of Viggo Mortensen and Aragorn for lots of reasons that are valid, not so valid, but in any case. But I love his performance. I think for me, though, what really stands out in terms of the casting and the acting performances doesn't come down to one individual, but the fact that this cast and the ones who are on screen, almost all the time, right? Elijah Wood and Sean Astin and the rest of the members of the Fellowship in this movie. The idea that they shuffled off to New Zealand and they lived there for months and they really just cohabitated with each other. And what seems to be very apparent about the working environment while they were filming these movies led to this other thing, this extra thing that you get with ensemble cast, where among the hobbits in particular, you can palpably feel how well they work together, how perfect and seamless that meshing of personalities was, how much their characters kind of overtook their own, personal relationships off screen. Even to think of any of those actors who I did not know any of them. I was not familiar with anything any of them had ever done prior to that movie. It's impossible to really separate them in my mind. And I think that's a good thing, because it speaks to just how just completely permeable, the story and filming and creating, that performance was something that you couldn't take one of them out of that group and then have the same thing on screen. And it included characters like Aragorn at times, like I just think that sensibility about the ensemble work, it pulled Ian McKellen and Viggo Mortensen into it, and all of the other characters. It just becomes so seamless in my mind. It's really hard to pick one thing out of it and say, this is what makes it great. Or, and again, like I said, if you remove any small peg out of the machinery of that cast, it kind of all crumbles again. It's just,
they were perfect in their roles, and then the chemistry was unbeatable. Yeah, it was just,
and it just, when you think about every variation and bringing of Liv Tyler, she fit in, even in just the few scenes she has with all of those other characters, it just always worked. Anyway.
And it kind of harkens back to what, again, Drew mentioned how these movies are influential. Like, we wouldn't have the MCU in the way we do without these movies. And the camaraderie between the cast of the MCU films echoes what we had here with Lord of the Rings. I mean, and when people enjoy working together, when there's an environment that is conducive to people enjoying their jobs, that's something that comes out to us, and I would be shocked if Kevin Feige didn't somewhere say, oh yeah, I watched the special editions, the special features on my Lord of the Rings discs, and I knew what I needed to do to make a Marvel Cinematic Universe,
Absolutely. Well, as with all adaptations from one medium to another, the Fellowship of the Ring had to contend with condensing an inordinate amount of content, story, character development, etc., into a film that was 3 hours and 48 minutes long. So do you feel that Jackson and the creative team succeeded in creating a film that provided a solid jumping on point for those who may have been completely unfamiliar with The Lord of the Rings? Or do you feel that there were any barriers for entry to those who may be new to the content? Philip, why don't we start with you this time?
Yeah, honestly, I'm sorry. I'm a little embarrassed how little I have to say about this. I think they totally nailed it. I mean, I feel like, I was a super fan, but I saw it sometime. I was always dragging people that had not read the books with me to the films to see them. And nobody was ever lost. Everyone always totally got it. And in fact, I think is a better bridge into the world of Middle Earth than even the books. Like, those books, as lovely as they are, as often as I reread them, and Silmarillion, I think is a masterclass on world building, and they're not as approachable to a 21st century first time reader maybe as they would have been when they were first written. Certainly not as well as the movies are now. And I think they're a perfect way in for any noob.
Claire?
Yeah, I think, thoughts about the story aside and the actual adaptation of the narrative, the fact that they brought Alan Lee and I'm forgetting the other artist off the top of my head. Someone help me, but
Low.
it's going to kill me. But anyway, my point being that they brought those artists that had worked on illustrations for the book. So when you open the Lord of the Rings book, you see beautiful illustrations by Alan Lee. And Weta Workshop and Peter Jackson and the set designers for the movie, they brought these artists in, and they were a day-to-day integral part of creating the visual world in the movies. So if you are someone who hasn't read The Lord of the Rings, the book, you're not just able to understand the story, but when you open the book and you start to look at the illustrations and hear the descriptions of the world that is on the page in front of you, it is immediately recognizable. You've been there before. You've been to Rivendell. You have been to all of these locales. When you look at Alan Lee's illustration of Moria, the Great Hall in Moria, you're looking at the movie. It's absolutely seamless, and I think that's a really great way. I'm trying to think of other examples that really exist like this, other than outside of superhero movies that we love and the comics that they echo. It's a really rare thing that a first-time reader has this great introduction, this primer. It's so easy to go from these movies to the books and understand where you are, and then you start getting all the little extra things and you're really happy. It's so much fun. I love it.
Drew, what about you?
John Howe is the artist's name.
Thank you so much.
Not John Lowe.
Oh God.
Back to Justin's point about Kevin Feige feverishly taking notes while watching these things. It's clear that he saw these and was like, this is how you make a niche thing accessible to the new and the old crowd at the same time. Like we say, you don't need to have read anything, and you can dip your toe in the movies and you'll be just fine. But then you realize, oh, it's a lot deeper. And I mean, it helps that they have the theatrical cuts and the extended editions. And I think the theatrical cuts work just fine, but then the extended editions flesh that out for the people who want something a little more. And okay, like Claire was saying, the little Easter eggs that are there, the king's foil, it's a weed. You're like, oh, okay, great. And that kind of thing carried over to the Marvel movies of like, here you go. Here's a little, bit that we can't spend, an hour developing, but here's a nice little nod for those of you who get these things. I think they did a masterful job. I know when this was coming out, like I would watch it with my group of friends, and I was the expert, and they'd be like, well, wait, what is this? And I was like, oh, that's in this. And then it built on that, and we're in the next movie, we're going to see that idea there, those gifts that Galadriel gave, like we're going to see that become more important later. And so it was really fun having these conversations with different levels of understandings of the text, of being like, oh, there's more. And then you have this discussion about it between, it's not just I know more, you know less, so we're not friends and we can't talk to each other. But it was a really great, the movies worked so well to like facilitate discussions and create a new community around it.
Justin, what about you?
The best answer I can give to this is that I'm uber Tolkien nerd, and my wife most definitely is not. And like Claire, we watch these movies every year.
And you're still married.
And no, my wife is the one who's driving that. My wife is the one who's like, I want to watch Lord of the Rings again. I'm like, okay, let's do it.
I like that she has to drag you along to watch Lord of the Rings.
I'm always struck, and I think I say this every time we watch it. My wife's like, yes, I know. But, the first 20 minutes, half hour of Fellowship of the Ring is 17 years of time in the book. And lots of exposition, lots and lots of, a well done exposition, but basically it's all being introduced to the backstory. And, you can tell Peter Jackson was, and Peter Jackson and co, they looked at this, they were like, okay, we've got to give them a lot of information, a lot of foundational information. We've got to make it interesting. we got to push them right in, And so, instead of the first thing we see is party planning, the first thing we hear is Galadriel telling us about the War of the Ring, or I guess not the War of the Ring, but
In the book, it starts with Smeagol and Deagle, which, like, you're kind of like, here's a small story that like will pay off later. It doesn't. I thought that's
no. The first book, literally, the very first, it starts with party planning. It starts with the very first chapter is a long expected party. Which is a parallel to The Hobbit, because the first chapter of that is an unexpected party. Nerd alert.
the Bakshi film, the Lord of the Rings cartoon does though start with what like they're all kind of bleeding into each other.
Yeah.
It's and there's never a bad thing. I mean, starting with a battle, a massive battle scene is, that's a good way to push you right in and make you get interested. Oh, that guy looks like, a medieval version of Darth Vader. What's going on? I'm interested, and for new people, that starts them asking questions, I mean, my wife doesn't care that Tom Bombadil's not in these movies. You know what I mean? And maybe the rest of us do, and that's okay. But it's absolutely, I think these movies are shockingly noob friendly, considering that there is a really high bar of entrance, in terms of getting everything down.
Well, and considering how intimidating starting Tolkien, like diving into Tolkien can be, because, there's a lot of stuff there. So.
And Tolkien spends a lot of time giving locations a real feel. I mean, there are a lot of words devoted just to this is the setting they're in,
yes. The tree they're sitting next to.
Yeah. And, and you get that with one beautiful shot, and that helps,
Well, we could talk about this film and The Lord of the Rings forever. Sadly, we are quickly coming up on time for the end of this panel, but I do want to ask a few final questions. This one, given that we aim to celebrate fandoms here at Fanbase Press, I want to give space to each of you to mention the scene that was most exciting for you to see on screen. And you don't have to cage it. You don't have to give context for it. Just briefly say, especially, fans of the film or anyone that's seen it will know them, but just call out whatever scene was most exciting for you. Drew, we'll start with you.
It's funny because I don't get to see it that often because I don't actually have the extended of Fellowship, but the trolls, seeing the trolls even just briefly in it was a nice, like, even they're in the theatrical, but very brief, like they're not even discussed, but just that idea of like, oh yeah, there's so much more to this world than we're even putting into this movie was a good sign to me going forward with these, this second and third part where I was like, oh, you're putting everything into this.
And Claire?
Well, one of the impossible things that I thought you just could not do on the screen and have me believe in it and go, yeah, that's what I wanted from that, was seeing a Balrog. There's a Balrog in this movie.
I think you've taken Justin.
Of things, I almost asked you to let me go first. Just to say, can I go before Claire? Because Claire always steals my stuff.
So
you were both of the same mind, and I love it. Philip, what about you?
God, the Balrog's a great one, but to me, the images of Fellowship of the Ring is wrapped up in the ring wraiths. So, I mean, and there's so many great scenes with them, but what do I do? The first moment in that film where I was like, this is the coolest thing I will ever see in my life was when they made it into the town, or they made it across onto the ferry or whatever, and the ring wraith, they realize how many of the ring wraiths there are, and then they ride down to the next, to the next bridge or whatever. Seeing the ring wraiths all together there in the dark and the rain was just the creepiest, most beautiful image. So yeah, probably that.
And Justin, to be fair, is there a second most exciting scene for you?
Just to expand, it's not just seeing the Balrog, which was cool, but it was the execution of that scene, the fall of Gandalf,
Wizard, you shall not pass.
You shall not pass. And actually, because I always read him shouting, "Fly, you fools." I didn't see it as that sort of more dramatic whisper that Ian McKellen gives it. And you know, that was, you know, tremendously powerful to me. But then, I mean, the shot that I saw in the trailer, the shot of the Fellowship walking over the crest of a mountain, and you actually get, it's really a character shot of everyone.
Mhm.
And I got to tell you, because when I saw that in the trailer, I knew who, I could name every Hobbit. I was like, oh, that's Merry, and that's Pippin. Oh, that's, I mean, like, I could feel it, you know, and that's, I mean, every time I see that, I still get a little like, oh my God, this is so unbelievably cool. You know, and it's such a small thing, but you know.
Yeah. Well, sadly, we are coming up on time. So I do want to ask each of you, if our viewers want to learn more about your work, what is the best way to find you either online or on social media? Claire, we'll start with you.
I am at Unexpected Hobby, and you might be able to discern the inspiration for my business name from our discussion today. I'm at Unexpected Hobby on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can find my book, A Geek's Guide to Cross-Stitch Journeys in Space, on the Fanbase Press website.
And Justin?
I post a new page of my hard-boiled fantasy webcomic, Hunter Black, every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. You can find it at hunterblackcomics.com. You can find me at justinpeniston.com or on Twitter at hunterblackcomx.
And Phillip?
My website is phillipkennedyjohnson.com, 2 L's in Phillip. And I'm social media, let's see, Twitter, I'm at Phillip K. Johnson, Instagram, Phillip_Kennedy_Johnson, Facebook, my full name, look me up.
Excellent. Andrew?
I'm at Fanbase Drew on Twitter, where I don't post, but listen to our podcast, Fanbase Weekly. You can hear me there.
Yes, absolutely. And as a reminder, if you are viewers like this panel, be sure to check out our podcast, the Fanbase Weekly, and all of our other content and catalog of titles at fanbasepress.com. We are also on all of the social medias, everything except MySpace. So just search for Fanbase Press. I want to say a huge thank you to all of our amazing panelists and to the team at WonderCon at home for their work in putting together this virtual event. It was such a pleasure hearing your fandoms for Lord of the Rings. So thank you for sharing your experiences with me today. And in these challenging times to our viewers, we wish you the best for a safe, happy, and healthy journey. Take care, everyone.